Welcome to BCS. Welcome to IT Now magazine. Sorry, we're momentarily late. We're bedeviled by technical issues, but we've pushed through it. So my name is Martin Cooper. Well, I've done that bit. So we're here today to explore hybrid working, and hopefully to enlighten on some actionable ideas that we can take back to your teams. Those and look at that kind of part of our title, that kind of what works, that part of our title. So hybrid, of course, the term we hear a lot about today in the popular mainstream media, in the popular press. But my hope is, as BCS and as IT Now magazine, we can take that story a bit further, dig a bit deeper, go beyond the idea that hybrid is merely people working from home or working from the office, working in two places. We're hoping to explore hybrid's foundations, its inner workings, its core ingredients, and ingredients for success. But enough about me. I'd like to hand over to our panelists to introduce themselves. Rachel Murphy sadly can't be with us today. She sends her regards, and I'm sure we'll be on another IT Now panel in the near future. But let me hand over to our panelists. If we can first start off maybe with Allie.
Yeah, thanks for that, Martin. So my name's Allie Law. Currently, I'm the managing partner for digital and IT transformation at Hanyu Partners. Been in the industry for about 30 odd years now at this stage. I'm a big supporter of the phrase that IT people, IT is all about the people. So I'm sure we'll cover that and a bit more during the session. Interestingly as well, in preparation for this, the company I work for is actually part of a wider Tarnanta group who also have a couple of recruitment businesses. So they've given me some interesting insight to play into today as well. So that's me.
Thank you very much, Sath.
Thank you, Martin. Yeah, great to be here. I'm Sathpal Singh. A lot of people call me Sath. I work currently as a practice lead in the UK banking sector. I've been with the BCS for over 20 years now. I started as a student member some years ago, and yeah, worked my way through right up to kind of fairly recently getting a fellowship. I'd probably describe my kind of role as sitting at the intersection of engineering, agile, and communities. A lot of my work is in engineering leading within my organisation, and also I do a lot of work in the agile community. I'm the current chair of the BCS Agile Specialist Group, but I also do a lot of work in community development, where it's a lot where my passions lie. As Ali said, I'm very much interested in the people and culture aspect of what we do.
Good job. Thank you very much. What I would say is we'd like this to be an interactive session. We'll set aside about 15 minutes to 20 minutes of our hour at the end for Q&A. So if anybody would like to drop in any questions into the chat, we'll pick those up at the end. Before actually we broadcast, we did get some questions about whether we're recording this session. We are going to record it, and we're going to put it onto the BCS YouTube channel. So keep an eye on our social media for links about that. We'll also do a write-up in IT Now, a summary article in IT Now. But anyway, enough from me. Let's start with some definitions, I guess. I'm interested in kind of how the panel defines hybrid. Is it more than just working from home and working from the office? Is there something more fundamental, something more elemental to the idea of hybrid? Maybe you would like to sort of lead us on this one, Ali.
Yeah, I think my starting point would be it's a much broader agenda, and it actually started before the pandemic. So if you go back, 2 years now, what you saw across the world was lots of different companies starting to experiment with their organizational structures. They're all searching for, I guess, similar things, whether that was pace, adaptability, whether that's more creativity, definitely looking to increase the competitiveness, that sort of thing. So what you saw was a drive towards, taking some ideas that really started within IT and applying at an organizational level. So that started even before the pandemic hit us. And then I think since then, we've seen just a huge change in the way we've had to work, forced on us, obviously, by what's happened. So I think it is part of a bigger thing. But interestingly for me, I think if you put your people lens on, a lot of what the organizations were trying to do is all about, and these words are overused, I know, things like empowerment. How do you create an environment where people can bring their best on a day in, day out basis? And how do you create trust within those environments? And I think it's really interesting that hybrids emerged out of all of this in a way that we'll discuss in more detail going through. But I do think it is part of that much bigger agenda that you're pointing at, Mark.
Cool. Sath, what's your take on the sort of definitions and the bigger picture?
Similar, I'd probably say slightly different than that. Yeah, I agree. It predates COVID, and I think what COVID did, and as many of us are fully aware, is that it kind of accelerated things. So, you know, it caused a lot of organizations to think really long and hard about their sort of operational models, their kind of IT strategies, and being able to help get their workforce continuing to work while they, you know, they had to basically be confined to their homes. So that's where the remote part came from, but that's dispersed. So I think, you know, we're not new to geographically dispersed teams. You know, we've actually, as Ali says, we've seen that for some years. I think what's changed is it was done on such a scale, and it had to be done very, very quickly. And for, as I say, for some organisations, I think it was a bit of a cultural shock, and I'm sure we'll go on to explore that. I think for me, the hybrid piece is this whole blended model. That term's been used a lot, you know, blended working. So some people are co-located, they're on site. Others, for probably good reasons, are off site. And how do you effectively come together and work and do all the things that you would traditionally do? So that's kind of where I sit with it. But it's not new, but I think there's lots of interesting things I'm sure you'll go on to explore with us over the course of this session.
Cool. Thanks. Yeah, I'm interested in the idea of scaling that. I suppose that cultural shock, because it makes me kind of reflect. I remember clearly the day that we were sent home, you know, by our board and by our directors, and it makes me sort of think back to my experiences of the early days of hybrid working. I think the first few days or first few weeks felt all about kind of tools and systems, about Zoom and Teams and Miro, and then I got the impression that the kind of the mood changed a bit. Really, it became more about people and interactions, which kind of sounds kind of familiar to me. There's, you know, it reminded me almost as the Agile Manifesto, the idea of individuals and interactions over processes and tools. I'm just wondering, maybe Sath, with your kind of agile perspective on this, is that coincidental? Did it? That's.
I would say certainly not. Not coincidence at all. No, you're right. It's a very good point to pick up on, and I think also, you know, being the passionate sort of agile practitioner that I am, that value is deliberately, you know, the first value of the 4 values of the manifesto. And when the original 17 co-authors put it together, you know, they were reflecting on their own experiences within, you know, the problems that they've been trying to solve and projects they've been trying to get delivered and all the failures they'd seen. You know, the tools help, the tools enable. And as you said, you know, we've all got used to using Mural and Miro and learning how to make them work or not in some cases. And that brought a lot of, you know, a lot of challenges. There's a steep learning curve. But at the heart of it, it is about people. It's about creating the most effective environment for collaboration and communication and letting people, you know, effectively come together and, you know, almost swarm around whatever the goal might be. So yeah, I'd say it's no coincidence at all.
I can see you smiling there, Ali. What's your take? Coincidence or by design?
I can't help but smile at what Saf's saying. I totally agree. For me, I mean, similarly, I remember 17th of March, almost 2 years ago, we basically all went off site, pretty much other than essential workers. And for me, the analogy to agility is quite strong because we all went off, we switched on our laptops and PCs the following morning with a lot of uncertainty. And that's what agility is key for, is dealing with those kind of uncertainties. So I think the similarities are so strong. And if you think about it, no one knew at that stage how long were we out for. And here we are almost 2 years later. Some people were thinking it was 6 weeks, but no one really knew. But I do agree. I mean, what we did is we went off site and we started doing the same things we did, but via remote cameras or whatever, and then start to adapt to the working practices to sort of explore that uncertainty, try to bring a bit more certainty to it. And I think one of the things we've touched on is we still don't have all the answers. We're still figuring out how some of this stuff works. I mean, the first time we had to do a remote workshop, how was that going to work when everybody's sitting on Teams or whatever? And I do strongly agree with Saf said about the tools supporting this, and it's driven the adoption far faster than it would ever been pre-pandemic. So the amount of people now are very adept at Teams or at Zoom or Miro or any of the collaborative tool sets, and the way we've had to adopt that's been forced to a large degree. And I think the good organisations have started to explore that to see how it can actually enhance what they do. It's probably, I mean, the research says anything between, I don't know, say 4 to 7 years of digital progression was done in sort of a year, which is a phenomenal amount of change driven in a short space of time. And exactly what agility mindsets are built for, not having to have all the answers, being comfortable in that fog of uncertainty, trying to find your way out of it, try things, experiment. So yeah, I can see, I absolutely agree with what you said. There's strong similarities between what happened and everything that agility tries to bring to bear.
Yeah, I find that really interesting. How it's almost kind of clarified the meaning of agility. I often have a sort of pet theory that agility with a lowercase a almost means just kind of getting people to do more with less faster. But actually, you guys seem to be talking very much about the sort of, you know, the spirit of the manifesto, very much the sort of spirit of Agile.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. Yeah, and I think you make an excellent point. So I think what's actually happened is it has, I think it's almost brought Agile back in some ways. You know, there's all this other debate, you know, what's the longevity of it? You know, is it dead? Of course it's not dead, because it's about people. And it's all about how you apply all the practices and principles and original values within your own context. And context is very important, and everyone's context is different. You know, I know there's, you know, we'll go into, I'm sure, talk about some of that, but it is about, you know, being value driven. And, you know, a lot of us now are driven by our values. And even when we, you know, we think about employment, and you think about the generations that are coming through now, a lot of their choices around employers are based on alignment of values. And I think that's true, and as it should be. And I think that's driving a lot of things. So yeah, I think that's one of the positive byproducts of what happened as a consequence of the global pandemic. We've had to think a lot more about how we communicate and collaborate, and how we do our best work when we're not all sitting in a room together.
Yeah, interesting. I like that. I like that point of value versus values. I think that's interesting. So I wonder, maybe sort of carrying on from that, really, I'm just wondering if COVID or hybrid taught us something about resilience. This may actually turn out to be the most rambling question in the history of webinars, so please stick with me. But, you know, I just wonder previously if organizations focused a lot on efficiency, and if they've now found to be fragile. You know, I'm thinking about just-in-time supply chains, things like that, organizations that had teams that were very stripped down, maybe didn't focus on the well-being of those teams, but actually really what we need is teams where, not built on specifically on roles, but on people with overlapping skills. So I've read somewhere about that we need teams with redundancy built in, but that's possibly the wrong, really doesn't sound quite right. But really, has hybrid shone a light on organizational resilience?
Yeah,
Allie,
I think for me, resilience shows up in a number of different ways. I guess where I'd start with is one of the things the pandemic did do was shine a real light into well-being and mental health that probably was nowhere near as prominent beforehand, for really understandable reasons, given the collective experience we've all had to endure for the last couple of years. And if I think about the agility community, there's been a drive towards things like psychological safety for quite a number of years, and it's another area. It's sort of, I saw it grow out of that kind of community before I saw it starting to hit some of the more other areas of different businesses. So I think that part of the resilience, individual resilience, has really started to shine through. Now, I think if you look back at sort of the tenets underpin the concepts, the beliefs we have as an IT community, especially around agility, that plays really well into that. Things like being respectful of, we've got a real mix of introverts and extroverts, and finding ways of working that allows both to work really well and provide that kind of resilience into the individuals as well. Bear in mind that a lot of what we do is real cognitive abilities, so you've got to build a space for these kind of things as well. All that ties in at a sort of an individual level. At a team level and an organizational level, I'm going to kind of go off piece just a little bit for a second, but if you look at what we've been through, the collective reliance on IT is growing immensely. It was always critical to just about every business. But now if you think what we can put in our golf scores online, we can order our pizzas, we get email alerts about when the ingredients are going out, ovens, all these kind of things. we're all pretty used to Amazon anyway before those kind of things. You can fire up your Netflix, your Amazon Prime, to drop a hat and start streaming. So that's set a whole series of expectations out there that are really, really high, and they don't know, most people won't know the complexities underpin all that. So that drives straight back into the heart of where we've been driving the industry and sort of maturing the ways we think about resilience to provide that kind of service to our customers. So you get straight back into, well, DevOps becomes at the heart of that, because it's got a big role to play in terms of the IT engineering disciplines we need to provide those kind of services, which creates new opportunities for our people. So you just think about the chaos engineering, you talk about SREs, all the fancy terms we'll love to invent, but it's all for the right reason, I think, and it's creating opportunities for people. It adds to the resilience. If I go back to the direct question you asked, there's always been this kind of drive for T-shaped people to some degree, which I think it's hard to do at times, because you still need really good depth in terms of your core expertise as well, which does bring a bit of resilience to the team. I think last thing I'd say about, because I've probably rambled in a bit too much with this one, but we force a conversation that's focused on the outcomes and how do we get to the outcomes. And I think that's where I think capacity in the team and creating slack in the team that allows people to explore that. The upside benefit of that is high value, and that's where I think it comes from.
Brilliant, thank you, Seth. What's your take?
Oh, well, first off, I'm glad you're talking about resilience, because it's such an important topic. And again, much like what we talked about earlier, I think it's been brought into sharp focus by the pandemic. I was talking earlier about organisations having to, rewrite their IT operating models to be able to accommodate a remote workforce. Effectively, what they've had to do is look to build operational resilience. But as Allie rightly says, we have to think about both operational resilience, but also personal resilience. So, the way I've always kind of viewed it and looked at it, and certainly my own interpretation of it, was a lot of this was about coping mechanisms. Because for many of us, we suddenly came into unprecedented times, and it was about organisations being able to cope with it and continue to do whatever it is they wanted to do. As Ali says, achieve their ongoing outcomes. In some cases, I'm sure some organisations took a fresh look at their backlogs and prioritised and reprioritised and made some hard choices, because they would have had to have done. But I'm sure not all of them did that. So cultures, again, were affected by how organisations responded to that, right? But the personal one for me is fascinating, because it took its toll on people, both in teams, in larger organisations, and on a personal level, because we all went through something different. Some people, suffered with it. Some people's family members suffered, sadly. Some people suffered fatalities, etc. And, I was one of those people. I lost a close family member, and it had a huge, profound impact on families. So I think resilience is a very, very important topic, and I'm glad we're talking about it. But it also made us think more about our well-being. Some organisations started to build nice things into their culture, making sure that meetings weren't an hour. For instance, earlier, give people time to get up and get away from their desk, be deliberate and intentional about it. Give people time to have longer lunch breaks and go for a walk, etc. So they weren't just stuck in their home all day. All these things are important, because people's mental health was impacted. And even little things like you went on to meetings and, they weren't the way they used to be. So, you would do things like have check-ins. So people are introducing check-ins, actually just going around and checking how everybody was. It wasn't something we did pre-COVID. You just came online, everybody had the agenda, and you got on with it in a very business-like fashion. Suddenly, we had to think more about, the human aspects of things. And again, I think these things have been positive byproducts of, the situation we found ourselves in. So yeah, I think it's a hugely important topic, resilience.
Yes, it's really interesting that you guys are talking a lot about the personal and the fact that, the operational, utterly essential, but there is no operational without the personal, really. I can see that we're getting some questions coming in on the chat. We'll get to those at the end, guys. So please keep them coming in. And as I say, we'll pick those up. We've got some time in the schedule to pick those up at the end. I'd like to shift gear a bit now and talk about the idea of trust, because I get the impression when you're working on projects and working with people, that trust really is the sort of the element, the oil between the gears, really. I'm just wondering how mechanisms like this, Teams and Zoom, how easy is it to kind of build trust across using these tools, and how easy is it to sort of lose trust? Maybe Ali, you want to lead us on this one?
Yeah, trust is a really powerful topic to think about and talk about. And again, I suppose it goes back to the agility drive we've had over the last 20 years, whether explicitly or implicitly, has put trust at the heart of that. So it's something that, because we are a people business, people like to form relationships, we make judgments based on what we think about trust day in, day out, whether we're conscious of that or not. And I think it's always useful to break trust down into component parts as well. So there are a few mental models out there that help with that. But it tends to fall into things like how reliable, credible are two sort of key topics. There's a couple of other things that spring to mind as well. And working remotely, I think, is it easy to build trust? I actually think it's a little bit harder, and you've got to explicitly work at it. So you've got to be more deliberate about what you do. I mean, it's old analogy. I work for a consultancy. If we're going to a new client, you can't exactly go and walk the corridor in the last couple of years. So, and that's where you build human interactions, get to know people and those kind of things. So I think that's just a bit tougher. By no means impossible, it's just tougher. But on the positive side, you're able to, and it's more acceptable now to work with people across the world rather than just having to jump on a plane and travel out there for a short meeting and travel back again. So, which obviously from a climate viewpoint is another big topic could concern as well. So I think it definitely has brought possibilities, and it's made certain things harder as well, I think, would be my short answer to that one.
What's your take, Seth?
Yeah, I'd agree with some of what Ali said. I think trust is always a challenging topic in any sort of working environment. I think really the reality here is, again, it's probably a positive thing, and it's reflecting on leadership management behaviours. So I think, certain managerial behaviours, like, those who sadly perhaps focusing a little bit more on, micromanagement, etc., have probably struggled and had to, take a different approach, especially if you're focused on, overly managing people rather than giving them the, the space and creating the environment for them to succeed and trusting in them, as Ali says. And I think leaders who naturally do that have probably not found it challenging at all, whereas those who perhaps don't work in that way have found it much more difficult. I think it is harder to create that kind of environment, given what we went through and we were all working. But I think if, again, coming back to, agile values and principles, and, if you provide clear direction, which, all good leaders should be doing, and your teams are clear on what they ought to be doing, they ought to be able to get on with it. You've outlined the why, you've talked about the what, and let them get on with the how. And that's what a lot of high performance teams, that's how they operate. That's why they're so successful. And again, a lot of the stuff has brought these management, these sorts of behaviours to fore. You know yourself from our previous conversations, I'm a huge advocate of things like social leadership. And if you look at some of those behaviours, again, that isn't about formal leadership. Formal leadership, that's typical in hierarchical organisations, granted the authority. This is more about those softer skills. And if leaders and managers can, kind of master some of those, I think it becomes much easier to let go and trust your teams and truly empower them. And you tend to find that they'll do great work because you also feel, empowered and good about the fact that you do in fact trust them.
Brilliant. Really, really good answers. Thanks, chaps. Quickly, I think we've got time for a couple more, but I'm interested in the retention, the battle for talents. And I'm just wondering how organizations should present this. And I'm wondering also what it should feel like to be part of a hybrid team. I can see you nodding, Seth.
I just like the question. What would it feel like to be part of a hybrid team?
What should it feel like, I guess?
Well, I guess in a good organisation, it shouldn't matter, right? So if you've nailed it and the tools work, that where people are, it's a kind of secondary or tertiary thing, because you've got the environment, you've got the tools, they're set up correctly, people know what they're doing, they're able to collaborate, they know how to reach people effectively. And when you choose to perhaps co-locate, you're doing it deliberately for a good reason. Maybe you're all going to go into a PI planning session, so you've agreed to congregate around a whiteboard physically in a room. But you're able to do some of these things, online through, some of the tools we've already mentioned. I think it's the flexibility thing is really I think at the nub of the whole hybrid working conversation. Organizations that want to continue to operate in that way, and I think most should, if they actually want to remain competitive and also attractive to talent right in the marketplace. This is all about how flexible are you prepared to be? And if you are prepared to be flexible, you're probably going to be more attractive to the best talent out there. And also, employees are now in an environment, we now live in this social age, and I've talked about with you before, where I think there's got to be flexibility, and that helps with the work-life balance. People are able to then get on with things that they love while also being able to engage meaningfully with their work. And if you get that right, you're going to have a tremendous working culture, and people are going to want to work for you.
Good, nice, very nice. Ali, what are your feelings?
I think getting it right would be amazing. I think if you're working in an organisation with a really strong purpose, and then you're empowered to work with your colleagues to unleash that kind of creativity with the right practices and tools to back it up, can only be a really engaging, rewarding workplace to engage and spend a bit of your career on. I think one of the things Sath said that I think is really important is the work-life balance. I think we've all experienced something really differently, a positive side as well. So certainly I have, where I'm not spending 3 hours a day commuting anymore, and I've got choices about how I can spend that kind of time. I think there is one really close area that I think is worth just reflecting on, which is the war for talent is escalating undoubtedly. The market and for certain skill sets are really intense out there. So attracting the right kind of individual, and some roles we're seeing are now being fully remote, for example. So the only drawback I see in that is if you've got other roles where the company is saying, no, it's either you've got to be hybrid or actually you've got to be on site, then there is a danger in that where you could start to get a bit of anxiety or worse creeping into the organisation, where some people are allowed to work remotely and others aren't. I think that's something that the leaders of the organisations really need to work hard at, to make it an environment where everybody feels valued. So there is something there. I think it's going to be more difficult for leaders. I mean, I haven't had a chance to read the comments, but I see leaders showing up quite a few that just caught my eye. I think that's a really difficult gig for them. And I do, one of the other things I think I said earlier, it does mean that leaders will need to value different things. And I mean, it's not so long ago where people thought time at desk equated to productivity, because that was the prevailing mindset for, I don't know, 40 years or whatever. So that's quite a shift for leaders to get. And I do wonder how much snapback we'll see over the next 2 years, as hopefully we get the pandemic behind us at some point. Are we going to see people go back to what was pre-pandemic, or they'll be embrace the possibilities that you get from hybrid and everything else? So it's something I think would be interesting. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays through, I think.
Brilliant, excellent job. So I think little thing coming into the world of speech writing now, that I wonder if we could just cover off by way of conclusion the one thing that you think we would like people to remember. Really, what's the one if people forget everything else that you guys have said, what's the one thing you would hope that people take away from all of this? Ali, maybe you want to kick us off with that.
I think that the one thing I would say is explore the possibilities if you can, because we've opened up a world out of such a torrid time of it, such a hard time. There's now, we've managed to accelerate these kind of possibilities, and if you've got the opportunity, help people to take advantage of them, create the environment where people can be successful. We've got so many tools at our disposal now, so explore the possibilities would be it in 3 words.
Brilliant. Sath?
Yeah, I'd probably say something similar. I'd certainly say we don't want to forget that one size doesn't fit all. So there isn't one solution to this that's going to fit every organisation and every culture and every need on an operational level or on a personal level. We should be experimental. So we should be prepared to, and again, come back to, some of the things that Agile advocates for, test and learn, try things if they don't work, learn from them, try something different, pivot, change. And also the thing I guess we perhaps haven't talked about, but it might come up in the Q&A, is in this sort of hybrid world we're now in, and the way that the nature of work is kind of shifting, we have to think a lot more about inclusivity. So even I've already experienced it being on some meetings where perhaps a lot of colleagues were like in a room, and it's easy for them to sort of chat away and chat across the desk, but there are also people on, on a call, on the other end of Zoom, and you've got to be able to facilitate, such meetings, etc., in an inclusive manner. So it requires you to have skills that perhaps many of us have not yet mastered. So there are a lot of learnings in this, but be prepared to learn, be prepared to pivot, and keep experimenting. And there isn't a right or wrong, that you've got to make sure it works within your context. Slightly longer answer than perhaps you wanted, but I think the points I'm very keen to stress, and things that are very close to my own heart, and the teams that I work with and the initiatives that I lead, inclusivity is now kind of a focal point as well because of all of this.
Cool. Really, really good. Really interesting. And just from my notepad, just as you guys have been talking, I've been really interested in your use of the word deliberate and being deliberate, and the reasons behind doing things. And again, that kind of operational versus the personal, and really focus on the personal. Again, I found really, really interesting. But if we can you chaps see the Q&A in the chat? I don't know whether Miracle Zoom you can. If we start from the top.
Chat's been busy.
What's that?
The chat's been busy. That's fantastic.
So if we start from the top. So how does a panel see teams striking the balance between autonomous empowerment and trust with the day-to-day expectations of organizations being met? So what's the essence of that one? Striking balance. Yeah, how do you manage trust or strike a balance between trust and maintaining the day-to-day expectations of the organization?
I don't think you manage trust. I think you try to create a culture of trust, right? An environment where people trust each other, and they trust each other based on certain behaviours. So again, like we've been saying throughout this conversation, if leaders create the right behaviours, the right kind of environments, and they lead by example, and the behaviours are positive, others will follow suit. That's what culture is. Culture is just common behaviours. Here's how we do things here. So I think trust is something that builds up based on everyone's kind of behaviours. It's a two-way thing. And empowerment, and again, that is perhaps one way you strike a balance, but I think empowerment comes from, so if I think about it in the Agile context, again, talk about self-managing teams. You don't just, self-management doesn't mean you say to a team, off you go then, go figure it out. It has to be a level of direction provided, some clarity on what we're trying to do. That's what sprint goals, etc., are all about. So as soon as people understand, what's the North Star here, they've got something to rally around and all align around. And it's the same with things like OKRs. All of this stuff's about alignment. If you do it well, people align, and you can empower them because they know what's expected of them.
Ali, have you got an idea or opinion?
Yeah, very similar. I think being clear on what outcome and what success looks like is at the heart of everything we're talking about. So for each team, you really need to know what outcomes you want to generate and how your success is going to be measured. And then give people guide rails, not guardrails. There's a big distinction for me between guardrails and guide rails. Give them the guides to say, here's the kind of things you need to be thinking about. And obviously, people aren't stupid. It might come as a stunning shock to some people, but everybody I know isn't daft. So they know that they can't go. If you're an insurance company, you're not going to go into retail banking as a squad. So give them the guide rails that shows them how to operate really well, and then create the space for them to get to those outcomes has always been key to what some of this looks like. And I mean, everything Saf said plays into this. The OKRs, all those kind of things are all geared towards that kind of thing. It can be really, really effective. Yeah, that'll be cool for me.
Cool, thank you. I mean, just to paraphrase Daniel's question here. He worked for an IT department where hybrid worked well. I think probably possibly that classic situation that many of us find ourselves now, where sort of senior leadership wants people back in the office, but the team is working well from home, working well hybridly, don't really see the need, don't really want to go back into the office. How do we kind of move and negotiate our way through that?
Yeah. So I kind of made a comment earlier, and I think I probably resurfaced that one. So I think as organizations are encouraging their employees back into offices, there is a balance to be struck. So do you have a good reason to go into an office? If you're going to go into an office, to be on site with other colleagues whom you work with regularly, so you can have conversations across the desk, or perhaps go into a room and co-create something on a whiteboard, etc., then it makes perfect sense to do so. And that is typically easier to do than using online tools, so it can be done, as we've proven. But if you're going to go into an office to sit there and then be on Zoom calls with people who in other parts of the world that you work with, there's very little value in basically making the commute and going into an office. So that's where I think a lot of the judgment calls will be made, and I think that's also the sorts of things that need to form part of any organizational policies that enterprises look to put in place to support their teams around when they ought to be on site and when it makes sense to be off site.
Brilliant. I mean, I've done that myself. I've gone commuted from where I live 40 odd miles into the BCS office, and then sat in a breakout room by myself all day on Teams. using much the same internet. Allie, what's your take?
Interestingly, so last week I was into the office to do some work with a couple of colleagues, and whereas, I mean, it was a creative type of thing and we had the whiteboards up, but instead of doing that, we all fired up our laptops, fired up Teams, got the documents up, and then edited the documents online. So we talked to each other physically, and I really enjoyed that, because I enjoyed being able to interact with my colleagues that I don't see that often recently. But we used the power of the tech at the same time, rather than just using traditional whiteboards. Even with smart whiteboards and all the rest of it, we were reading straight into documents and Teams. And I actually found that really useful. There would have been a danger, of course, just like you said, you go in to sit in a Teams call all day, which just defeats the purpose. I mean, that's why you can just do that more effectively from home anyway. So, and it is a tricky one. I mean, there's going to be organizations that just insist that people go back in. I know that. I happen not to work for one of those. We're far more flexible in our approach, and so I enjoy that kind of thing. So it definitely is not an easy one. But the thing that really resonated, I think, is the word used earlier, deliberate. So as Saf mentioned as well, if you're going to go in, at least it's forcing people to get really specific about the value they want to get out from what they're going to do, and maybe knock some of these endless meetings on the head that used to just permeate corporate life 2 years ago. Probably still does to a large extent.
Cool. Very, very good. To paraphrase, Carrie's asked a question about, I think, to paraphrase, the idea of that being in the office, water cooler moments, serendipity creates innovation. So how in the home working environment can we achieve that sort of those ad hoc social interactions? I can see you leaning forward, Sath.
I was going to speak, but then there's my front door's ringing, and I don't actually know if there's anybody downstairs going to answer the door. So there you go. There's one of the challenges of working from home. There's the flip side of it, right? So I don't know what's going on downstairs. But to your point, yeah. So we're talking about the water cooler moments. Remind me specifically what you were. Because I got distracted there.
If you do need to go answer your door, we do understand. How do we kind of create and replicate those more ad hoc social interactions?
Yeah, that is harder, definitely. I think most of us would acknowledge that. I think that is a lot more difficult. We are definitely losing that, or have lost that. It's harder to get hold of people. You're dispersed. I'm sitting in my home now. You guys are in your homes. We can't just suddenly congregate in the coffee machine, right? So we have lost that. Can we recreate that? I personally don't believe we can, but what we can do is try to find alternatives. And I think that's what so, things like, so for a while when the pandemic really kind of escalated and it was hitting everybody hard, and we were all suddenly, forced, out of our offices into our homes. I experienced things like, we used in the early period, we used to run things like fikas. I don't know if you know what a fika is, but fika is kind of like it's part of Swedish culture. It's basically a coffee and cake. But the point is, it's not just about you having a coffee, a cake. It's a social gathering. It's a bit of a ritual in Scandinavia, certainly in Sweden. And the point of that was, again, to the point we were making, it's about being deliberately taking out 15, 20 minutes to do that and get together, and everybody congregates around. Okay, you're on a Zoom or whatever technology you're using, but you're focused on the social interaction, you're focused on the informal conversation, you're focused on the how is everybody and having a bit of kind of, as we call it in our part of the world, a bit of banter, a bit of light-hearted chat, a bit of catch up on the weekend. That's the sorts of things we are doing. It's different to water cooler moments, but it's an online equivalent, so to speak.
Allie, what's your feeling on creating those moments of serendipity?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly hard, and I do agree with Saf. I think there are things you can do concept, but it's not quite the same, and there's other things as well, I think, that I contemplate on. So if you go back in time, one of the things I used to talk to new project managers about when I first started out was, if they walk into a room and their gut tells them something's not quite right, then generally speaking, what they're doing is at least in some level connecting into how humans in the office are actually thinking and feeling about things, irrespective of what they're actually saying. And it's so impossible to do that with a camera in the way. So our duty of care to people as well becomes harder at the same time. You can't see the body language, you only get a certain aspect of it and everything else. So it's another area as well, I think, is just incredibly hard when you're fully remote. So I don't think there's an easy answer to the serendipity question at the water cooler. It's just not easy to replicate at all, I don't think.
Cool. Interesting. I mean, taking a broadish sweep across quite a few questions, actually, I think a few of them can be sort of summarized, I think, into good meeting etiquette, managing meetings correctly. I mean, what are your tips on, how to get the best out of meetings, how to create meeting environments that work for everyone, productive meetings? Sath, what's your take on kind of good meeting etiquette?
Yeah, that's good. And again, I'd say what we've been through the last 20 months is made us think a little bit harder about that. And again, I think that's a good thing. I think team charters are good, so there's nothing worse than turning up for meetings and there's no clear agenda, nobody knows why they're there, etc. That's even worse in a kind of online environment in some cases. So I think that's what we've seen, create a kind of clear set of rules around engagement, especially back to the hybrid thing, how you're going to make sure everybody's inclusive. And I think through this, perhaps we haven't necessarily realized, but we've probably all become better facilitators because we've kind of had to. So again, there's been some positive byproducts here. But yeah, I think, meeting guidelines, charters, rules around, how you engage. So, if now, there's only 3 of us, it's quite a small group, but, if Ali wanted to chip in with something, he can use the online facilities and put his virtual hand up, then, the facilitator knows that, he's ready and he wants to chip in, and he can be invited in to do so, and it prevents us all talking over each other. It's that type of thing. And I think, having little moments to pause, somebody's, but it's just these little things make a big difference in having a productive, constructive meeting where everybody gets to contribute, and also making sure, if you're on a call and it's being dominated by 1 or 2 people, that, everybody's, kind of conscious of that and, makes a conscious effort to go, such and such hasn't actually spoken. Would you like to contribute? And that bit's maybe actually arguably slightly easier in an online meeting than it is when we're all sitting together in a room where people are often sadly talking over one another.
Yeah, it's interesting. I remember clearly the day that we all kind of transitioned to working from home, and the first big Teams meeting we had, hosted by our director. I hope he's not looking, but it was just a sort of discordant kind of chorus of voices, people speaking over each other. It's interesting how people have evolved a kind of an etiquette, an online etiquette now, and this idea of sort of pausing and leaving space and not speaking over each other and sort of allowing for latency and such things. But Ali, what's your take on kind of good meeting etiquette?
I think for me, a lot of this is how do you manage energy? So what I mean by that is avoid the traps that, I mean, if you think about, certainly in my old role, you'd be walking between meetings, so at least you got some downtime. Whereas certainly initially when we went off site, it was meeting after meeting with no breaks, and that's just not feasible. So think about how you manage your own energy, frequent breaks being really built in, limiting meetings to 45 minutes rather than an hour, giving people the space to then get up and walk about, go outside, get some fresh air or whatever. And I mean, we all know that actually doing things that allow you to bring more energy into the room rather than working longer and longer hours is far more productive for everybody and far better for your well-being as well. So I'd encourage people to think about, I mean, there's a whole topic around how do you increase people's energy, starting with having good purpose and all the rest of it all the way through, and then some of the more mechanical things about limits in the meetings, frequent breaks and everything else. And people are different. Some organizations are different in the way they can do that. But I would definitely say focus on how you can bring more energy into it, and you'll get better results coming out of it.
Excellent, thanks. I'm just looking down through the questions. So we've got one from Matt. Should organizations develop a hybrid working policy detailing the purpose of the approach and the expectations of the organization? So should we develop policies, Sath?
Absolutely. People need to know what the plan is, what the expectations are. But what I'd also say is, if we're going to create policies, if at all possible, involve people in the creation of those policies. So let's not have one person or two people or a team who perhaps responsibility is to go away and squirrel away into a basement and create something and out it pops, ta-da type thing. I think let's gauge a cross section of your organization. Again, get some diversity of thought. Bring different people in from different backgrounds, different situations, circumstances are different, and then come up with something which should cater for everyone and be, again, fairly flexible. So Ali said something earlier that I liked around the sort of guide rails versus guardrails, but also a lot of these things, I think the secret is in creating a framework. In fact, I've talked about this in my organisation. Create a framework. Again, a framework should be flexible enough so people know what the kind of boundaries are, what the parameters are, and what the key expectations are. But there's enough flexibility in there to suit different scenarios, because all of our circumstances are different.
What about you, Ali? Policies?
Yeah, I think all good policies have got certain things in common. A, they're short and they're real clear about what expectations they're setting and what outcomes they're looking for, and those are always useful. I hate when I see 100-page policies, to use an extreme example, because can you actually interpret all of that? So shorter the better as far as I'm concerned.
Brilliant. We've had one more question in. How do we translate this to healthcare service users who do not have the skills to use small tablets or smartphones, and don't have necessarily and with no resource to use heavy tech like Teams? So how can we support and bring people into our teams who don't have the kind of the big technology, big laptops? What's your view on that, Ali?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure I fully understand the question. I mean, I think it's pulling it that not just NHS, but there are large swathes of the population that don't have broadband. So digital exclusion is a real issue that we need to, as a society, we need to be really mindful of. So I'm a strong supporter of where you see initiatives that are trying to address that, and it covers a whole multitude of things. So not everything could be 100% online. It's just not right, not feasible. All organizations should use a mix of channels. whether that's back to phone or face to face or whatever. We can't exclude people from society just because they don't have access to technology. There are lightweight technologies as well, of course, and lightweight alternatives to the heavyweight enterprise solutions. Of course, the downside is people always worry about privacy, security, and all the rest of it, quite rightly so, especially with NHS, where you're dealing with really sensitive data and all the rest of it. But there are other ways around it. The key thing for me is actually the good sort of things we've been talking about during this call aren't necessarily all about using the technology and online. So applying those principles in general is always quite important. I'm not sure I'm actually getting to the heart to answer the question, but
I think it's interesting. I think your remarks and sort of segue into digital poverty is interesting, and just people designing and creating the services, assuming everybody has fast broadband and big laptops and fancy Macs, but actually, really a good service is one that works on slow broadband and is designed almost to kind of accommodate the worst case scenario, I guess, not work well in the best environments. But I think we're kind of pretty much out of time, guys, actually. So I'd like to really thank you for your time and your insights. We'll go through the questions again. If we've missed anything, I will pass them on to the guys. And as I say, this is being recorded, so we'll get it up online. We'll let everybody know via social media when it's available, and then we'll do also a summary, an editorialized summary in the next issue of IT Now magazine. So thank you very much, Sath, and thank you very much, Allie. And of course, thank you to our guests for sending in their questions.
Nice one.
I know.
Thank you.